Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've once again seen the world of politics and sports getting caught up with one another in Tasmania, particularly in the last few weeks. And there has been a lot of noise. What is going on down there? What is going on with the stadium? And what is going on with the AFL team? And I did think it would be a good chance to take a look at the timeline, the history, and make a few judgments about what is going to be happening with this team going forward. And it is certainly on shaky ground. We do know there is an election coming up in Tassie next month. A lot of opposition to the stadium. It is fairly unpopular amongst the Tasmanian public, although there is also a lot of support for it as well. So if we take this right back to the beginning, the Tasmanian AFL bid was predicated on the construction of a new stadium in Hobart at Macquarie Point. A lot of people saying, well, we can have the team, we want the team, but you don't have to build the stadium. We know the team is very popular among the Tasmanian people, but obviously the stadium, at this stage, it is more unpopular than popular. But the main point is the bid was predicated and dependent on the construction of a new 23,000 seat stadium at Macquarie Point with a roof. And originally this was planned to cost around 715 million, but we have seen a bunch of cost blowouts in that time. And we do have Jackie Lambie, the Greens, a few other political figures down in Tasmania saying, well, get rid of the stadium, but keep the team. And the AFL has said from day one, there is no new Tasmanian team without the stadium. And the AFL been very strong on that. Their position has not changed to this day. And we are seeing maybe that come to a flashpoint in terms of the election and also the vote on the stadium that will be coming. Now, originally the stadium was projected to cost 715 million. We did have the Commonwealth government coming in, putting in 240 million, 15 million from the AFL, and the balance being funded by the Tasmanian state government. I said at the time that's really unbelievable to where you'd have a stadium built for $715 million in the current climate. I did say this thing would cost $1 billion plus from the get-go. There was another announcement a few months later after the stadium was announced where the projected cost went up 60 million up to 775 million. And then in early 2025, they did come out and say, the Tasmanian government before the budget, the cost had gone up to $945 million. And now we are really talking about a more realistic figure in terms of that. When you look at Perth, when you look at Adelaide, some of the recent stadium constructions that have gone on, obviously the Olympic Stadium in Brisbane, they're saying closer to 3 billion. And there's no way you build a stadium in 2026-27 with a roof for under $1 billion, even if the capacity is only 23,000. And obviously once that was announced, the stadium potentially got even more unpopular among the majority of the Tasmanian people. And it is worth noting that, of course, the stadium really got off the ground by Labor committing to the build. Initially, it was just the Liberal Party pushing this case. They did put the bid together, and there was no chance of getting this thing built without the support of Labor, but ultimately that was agreed upon because they said, well, it is going to create a lot of jobs for Tasmanians, a lot of work and a number of projects that are finishing up down there, including a bridge. A lot of those people would be out of work. So the Labor Party said, well, we will support the stadium on the condition that it creates 5,000 jobs in Tasmania. But that did get a lot of criticism. Obviously, there is some legitimate concerns about whether the state can actually afford this. Obviously, you do look at hospitals, schools, housing, all the important issues, and a stadium just isn't as important as them, no matter which way you want to spin it. Obviously, you'll come out and say, well, the federal government's putting in 240 million. It's not like the state is paying the whole bill, and that is a legitimate argument. But a lot of the anti-people down there, the NIMBYs and things like that, they're just really not on board with this thing. And ultimately, it did come to a head on June 11 to where the Labor leader, Dean Winter, came out and put a no confidence motion to the Tasmanian Parliament, basically around the way the Liberal Party had handled money, not only because of the stadium, but obviously that is a large part of it. There was a cost blowout on the stadium and a number of other things. And they said, well, Tasmania really heading for a debt spiral to where there's no way they're going to get this under control without reining in the spending. And ultimately that no confidence motion was passed 17-18, and it did trigger an election, which is going to be happening on the 19th of July. And clearly the stadium is going to be a big part of this argument. Really, it's a very fine line they're trying to tread here to where there's no way this thing can get built without the support of both the Liberal and Labor Party. At this stage, Labor saying we do still support the AFL team, we do still support a stadium, but not necessarily the Macquarie Point Stadium that is being discussed at this point. Of course, the Liberals try to push this through as a project of state significance to where it would make it easier to build and not able to be challenged in Parliament by other parties and other independents and parliamentarians who didn't want it to go ahead. And then Rockcliffe came out and said, no, we're going to push it through. We're going to have a vote. It's going to go through the lower house and then the upper house, and this thing will be essentially set in stone by July. But of course, now with the early election, that has been put on the back burner, and most likely there is still going to be a vote that goes ahead, but it is really unknown at this point what the Parliament's going to look like in terms of pro-stadium people, anti-stadium people. So there is a lot of doubt around what happens there. And in terms of the Tasmanian parliamentary system, they do a sort of proportional allocation of seats to where, let's say the Labor Party gets 30% of the vote, they'll get roughly 30% of the seats. If the Liberals get 40% of the vote, they get roughly 40% of the seats. So it is a bit different to the federal system and a lot of the other states, but it does mean that it is really hard to get a majority government. So you are looking at a minority government as there was previously with the Liberals, or some sort of coalition government. Labor's already said we're not going to be doing a coalition government with the Greens, who are anti-stadium full stop. So most likely we're going to have some sort of minority government. Most likely at this stage it is going to be another Liberal minority government, although it does remain to be seen. It is really hard to tell in terms of the limited polling. We did get a poll in May where it did have Labor at 31, Liberals 29, the Greens, who are anti the stadium, at 14, Jackie Lambie Network, who are also anti the stadium, at 6%, and then around 17% of independents and others, some of which support it, some of which don't. So we're likely going to see a hung parliament to where you have the minor parties and independents holding the balance of power, and it just does throw more doubt on this project. And the other significant factor is the Labor Party have been very careful to where they say we support a stadium, not necessarily the stadium. And a lot of people reading between the lines and saying, well, they want to push this Macquarie Point 2.0 stadium plan, which is a proposal that was put together by a former Labor Premier of Tasmania, Paul Lennon, to where the stadium would be located a little bit further up the Macquarie Point area, I believe at Regatta Point. There will be some reclaimed land on the river there, and they're saying this project potentially costing up to 2.2 billion. However, a lot of private investment would go into it in theory, although there's not really any evidence to where those private investors are coming from, and the impact on taxpayers would be smaller. And a lot of, I guess, conspiracy theories have said, well, the Labor Party is going to pivot to this idea if they win the election, and then potentially develop the Mac Point area for housing, for other development where the Liberals want to put the stadium. But again, this really hasn't been fleshed out. It hasn't really gone anywhere. It is just an idea. The AFL saying, well, we have approved it based on the original plan to where the stadium would be built at the proposed Mac Point site. And a lot of people are saying, well, Labor's been very sneaky around this to where they will say we support a stadium, and it might mislead people thinking, well, they're going to get this thing built, and then if they win the election, they'll pivot to that. And who knows what impact that will have on the AFL team. So really, there's a lot of question marks. The whole thing essentially comes down to this election. If the Liberal Party win a majority, which is very unlikely, obviously this will happen as proposed at the Mac Point site. If there's a minority Liberal government, well, we're in a similar position as we were before the election was called, where it goes to a vote. And who knows, it depends how that falls in terms of the Greens, in terms of Jackie Lambie Network and independents, which way they swing, whether they are pro or anti-stadium. The more power that goes to the minor parties, again, the more doubt that is put on this project. And then, of course, it depends on Labor's position, whether they do agree to vote for the original Mac Point plan if they are in opposition, or they do pivot to the other plan and decide to vote against this in the Parliament, and the whole thing just blows up. So where does that leave the team and the stadium as a whole? I do still think there is going to be an outcome in terms of a stadium build in Tassie. But there is a big doubt in terms of this current plan. I mean, the cost is going to be over $1 billion, clearly. There is some doubts about the roof, what impact that'll have on cricket, particularly Test cricket. And you might say, well, it doesn't matter, it's for footy primarily. But you really need the highest amount of content in terms of events, sporting matches, etc., to be able to be hosted at the stadium for this thing to be viable. If you're cutting out Test cricket, you know, there's up to 5 days a year that stadium's not going to have access to in terms of content. The bid was predicated, I believe, on around 40 days worth of events per year, which does seem optimistic. Obviously, you have have 7 or 8 AFL games, around 4 or 5 BBL games, and then maybe some AFLW, maybe some soccer or the odd rugby game here and there, maybe a few concerts a year. Still hard to see how this gets to 40 days a year, even with Test cricket. And obviously Tasmania doesn't get a Test match every year. Maybe on average they only get a Test match one in every 5 years. So the roof is obviously a concern there. In terms of killing the team entirely, it is a real possibility. Unfortunately, the AFL has been very strong. No stadium, no team. If it comes down to it, do the AFL have the balls basically to make the call, well, we're going to kill the team? There is a lot of goodwill both in Tasmania and in the mainland in general in terms of a Tasmanian team. Most people say, well, it is a footy state, it does deserve its own team. And the AFL, really, a lot of the decisions they have made recently with the MRO, with fixturing, with broadcasting, with the tribunal, they're not exactly the most popular at the moment. So the Andrew Dillon legacy, if you like, if he was the one to kill the Tassie team, well, that's really not a good look for him. But there's no way this team happens without a stadium development of some sort. People are saying, well, just play at York Park in Launceston. By the way, that is getting a $130 million redevelopment over the next few years. But really the issue with that stadium is it's located in Launceston. It's just a regional city around 100k. People are saying, well, there's going to be issues in terms of player retention and the ability to attract players to Tasmania, full stop. But if they are asking them to locate themselves in Launceston instead of Hobart, it is actually going to make things a lot more difficult. And you also just need to base it in Hobart. It is the largest population centre. It is where the most corporates are located, so you get more of those premium hospitality clients. They are high yielding in terms of revenue. So it's just not an option to base an AFL team in a regional city of about 100k. And the other idea is, well, you just play at Bellerive. But the problem with Bellerive, really, although the stadium itself is not up to standard, it only holds around 15-16k. The main issue is actually the location. And if you look at the aerial shot, it is basically in the middle of a residential suburb. Even if you bulldoze the whole ground and rebuild it with state-of-the-art grandstands, there's nothing you can do in terms of the location. There's no apron, there's no area around the stadium for people to move in and out. There's only one basically road in and out of the ground as well. It's just a nightmare in terms of crowd control, and it's just not a modern stadium location by any sense of the word. So really it has to happen at Macquarie Point or some other central Hobart location. And obviously Macquarie Point's been the only one really talked about in any serious capacity. I do think that one area where the AFL might relent is the roof. The roof clearly adds $200-300 million on top of the project, and people will say, well, it's windy, it's cold, it's wet, and maybe that's all true, but you do see the weather in Melbourne, in Geelong. Honestly, it's not that much different. They do play night matches there. We saw the Hawthorn-Adelaide game in Launceston the other day, and people said, well, that's exactly why Tasmania needs a roof, but it wasn't raining. It was just sort of dewy because of the fog, and obviously the product wasn't that good to watch on TV, but you can't really blame the weather too much by the fact that both teams were incredibly inaccurate. And it's not like we haven't seen bad games in Melbourne or Geelong or Perth or Adelaide or really anywhere, but you would need some sort of stadium design to where all the fans were covered and maybe just the playing surface was exposed, so you get the fan comfort. People aren't sitting out in the freezing cold in the wet, but the actual stadium itself isn't enclosed and the playing surface is exposed. That way there wouldn't be any issue with cricket or anything like that, and it would keep the cost down $200-300 million. But clearly the AFL coming out taking a hardline position. They want this thing built with a roof. Obviously they want it built full stop. I think if the whips were cracking, they may relent on the roof. And if you look at it from the perspective of Tasmanian Labor, Dean Winter coming out and basically forcing an election to where the Tasmanian people only went to the polls last year for their state election and obviously in May for the federal election. There's a lot of election fatigue. People aren't happy with this. The Jeremy Rockcliffe government coming out and saying they're wreckers. I think that label is hitting. People aren't liking the fact that they have to go back to an election, which is fair enough. And even for him, if he does end up pulling out the rug from under everyone's feet at the last minute, if he was to become the Premier and saying we don't support the Macquarie Point Stadium, it is going to be an incredibly unpopular and polarising move. And it would make him really a pariah and a very unpopular figure among a big part of the Tasmanian population. And if you're coming in as Premier, really, that isn't what you want to do. And the other question is, even if the stadium does get built and ultimately does pass through Parliament, what does that look like in terms terms of the timeline. The plan was for the Tassie team to come in 2028 and the stadium to finish construction by the start of 29. So they would play the first season at Bellerive and in Launceston. Possibly that's pushed back to 2030 at this stage. I still think the AFL will be keen to get them in 2028. There is a clause to where if the stadium isn't 50% constructed by the end of 2027, the state government has to pay the Devils $4.9 million in compensation. Maybe that ends up getting stretched out over 2029 or 2030 as well if the stadium is delayed. So if I had to judge at this point, I would say there's around a 25% chance this thing falls over entirely. No stadium gets built, no team. I think there's around a 25% chance the stadium is built as projected with the roof on the current site. But honestly, I think the most likely scenario is some sort of stadium construction in Hobart, in and around Macquarie Point, but possibly a revised design where they've removed the roof. It is going to be an open-air stadium, and obviously you just have some sort of overhang to where the majority of the fans are covered. It is a modern stadium. It is world-class, maybe like a mini Optus stadium, something like that. But it is just probably the most cost-effective way to reduce the bill, but also get all the amenities and the benefit of getting an AFL team into the state of Tasmania. But anyway, guys, let me know what you think. It is a big watch. 19th of July, Tassie election. This team is going to be basically decided in the ballot boxes around the state of Tasmania.